The concept of dynastic privilege has always existed as a fragile contract between the ruling class and the public, where absolute power demands an equal measure of public responsibility to sustain itself. When Andrew Mountbatten Windsor entered adulthood, he did so with an unprecedented array of historical advantages that virtually guaranteed a life of uninterrupted prestige and flawless global influence. As the second son and widely acknowledged favorite child of Queen Elizabeth II, his path was cleared of the typical obstacles that define the human experience, creating an artificial environment where every door opened automatically, and deference was a baseline expectation. This extraordinary level of institutional coddling does not merely foster ordinary confidence. Rather, observers note it hardened into an impenetrable psychological armor that separated him from reality. From his early 20s, those who crossed his path remarked that his royal identity was not a duty he performed, but a weaponized status he used to dominate every social and professional interaction. He did not navigate the world as a man earning respect, but as a walking title demanding immediate, unquestioning submission from everyone in his orbit. This deep-seated obsession with status manifested in a behavioral pattern where he would repeatedly inject his title into casual conversations, ensuring the weight of his dukedom settled disputes before they could even materialize. Former acquaintances and social peers from his youth described a personality captivated by the submissive reactions of others, frequently dropping his rank into jokes and offhand remarks with a calculation that was entirely devoid of subtlety. For this particular royal, inherited rank was never viewed as a solemn civic responsibility or a debt owed to the public treasury that funded his existence. It was treated as his core identity, leaving a profound vacuum underneath when that prestige began to crumble. Inside the private quarters of the royal residences, away from the carefully curated gaze of the British press, the mask of royal benevolence dropped entirely to reveal a highly abrasive and commanding persona. While the reigning monarch was universally celebrated for her meticulous politeness and egalitarian warmth toward palace employees, her favorite son reportedly adopted an incredibly harsh, militaristic tone that alienated the household staff. The phrase "do it" became his defining linguistic trademark, delivered not as an encouraging piece of leadership, but as a curt, dictatorial mandate that tolerated zero delay or human error. Former household aides and courtiers alleged that if his domestic whims were not executed with absolute immediacy, his volatile temper would flare violently, disrupting the structured tranquility of the palace. He routinely addressed seasoned palace officials and dedicated domestic workers as if they were low-ranking subordinates in a strict military chain of command, completely oblivious to the domestic nature of the setting. Stories regarding his hyper-entitled domestic demands began to leak into the public consciousness, creating an image that bordered on the utterly absurd yet persisted due to consistent corroboration. Housekeepers were allegedly subjected to a rigid morning ritual, where they had to navigate multiple flights of stairs just to draw back his bedroom curtains while he remained stationary in bed, refusing to perform the simplest human tasks. Staff members faced abrupt dismissal or severe reprimand for infractions as trivial as wearing an unapproved style of necktie or possessing a facial mole that he claimed offended his aesthetic sensibilities. Whether every single domestic anecdote was precise down to the smallest detail, the cumulative narrative painted an incredibly damaging and consistent portrait of a man who viewed human service as total submission rather than a professional partnership. Outside the palace gates, this projection of unearned superiority intensified significantly as he began to craft a public lifestyle defined by relentless, conspicuous consumption and elite global travel. He traversed the globe utilizing private aviation, frequented the most exclusive luxury resorts in Europe, and aggressively cultivated deep personal relationships with controversial international billionaires and political figures. The highly mocking moniker, Air Miles Andy, did not emerge from a media vacuum. It was the direct result of mounting public irritation at what appeared to be an endless cycle of self-indulgence at the taxpayer's ultimate expense. During prolonged periods when ordinary British citizens were navigating severe macroeconomic hardships, high unemployment, and public sector austerity, his lavish lifestyle appeared shockingly tone-deaf and deeply offensive. Serious questions inevitably emerged from investigative journalists and parliamentary watchdogs regarding how this immense opulence aligned with his official sovereign grant allowances. When his highly publicized marriage to Sarah Ferguson inevitably unraveled, the subsequent breakdown transformed into a chaotic tabloid circus rather than the dignified, quiet separation traditionally expected of senior royals. Their highly unconventional decision to maintain an intensely close domestic and financial partnership long after their legal divorce added layers of public curiosity and widespread media mockery. Simultaneously, the meteoric rise of Princess Diana's global popularity served to highlight the stark, unflattering contrast between two entirely different approaches to modern royalty. While Diana successfully projected authentic human warmth, profound empathy, and relatable vulnerability, the Duke of York projected nothing but rigid institutional rank and cold genealogical hierarchy. Where the Princess of Wales built genuine emotional connections with the public, he chose to reinforce traditional class barriers and remind the world of his unassailable position. By the close of that turbulent decade, his public image had undergone a massive, irreversible transformation from a dashing naval hero into a symbol of arrogance. The profound public resentment forming around his persona was not a sudden phenomenon. It was a slow, cumulative structural collapse built on decades of entitlement. Long before the catastrophic legal scandals emerged that would permanently define his historical legacy, the foundational bricks of deep public distrust and institutional alienation had already been firmly laid. A profound structural shift occurred when he officially accepted the high-profile position of the United Kingdom's Special Representative for International Trade and Investment, a role envisioned as his serious professional second act. The former naval helicopter pilot was tasked with serving as a high-level diplomatic bridge between major British commercial enterprises and expanding foreign markets. On paper, the strategic appointment possessed a logical framework, leveraging a well-connected royal to open doors for domestic corporations within competitive overseas jurisdictions. In reality, the high-stakes trade role exposed the massive systemic fault lines in his personal judgment, financial associations, and ethical boundaries. As trade envoy, he traveled extensively through complex geopolitical landscapes across Eastern Europe, Central Asia, and the volatile regions of the Middle East. He delivered keynote speeches at prestigious business forums, conducted private audiences with foreign heads of state, and occupied center stage at global investment summits. However, alongside these carefully scheduled official state engagements, a deeply troubling parallel pattern of personal socializing and private networking began to rapidly emerge. He was frequently photographed in the company of wealthy foreign oligarchs, politically exposed businessmen, and controversial power brokers whose massive fortunes were directly tied to murky state-controlled industries. While seasoned career diplomats operated with extreme caution around such polarizing individuals, the British prince appeared uniquely comfortable navigating their opaque financial ecosystems. One of the most intensely scrutinized private transactions involved the sale of his former matrimonial home, Sunninghill Park, which had languished on the real estate market for years. The property was unexpectedly purchased for an inflated price, significantly above its market evaluation, by a wealthy Kazakh oligarch closely connected to the country's autocratic ruling elite. Although no explicit legal wrongdoing was ever proven in a court of law, political critics fiercely questioned why a senior royal was engaging in private multi-million-dollar property deals with controversial foreign figures. The global optics of the real estate transaction were severely damaging to the United Kingdom's international reputation, particularly given the widespread corruption concerns associated with that specific foreign regime. Another major diplomatic controversy erupted when he was documented socializing with the family members of authoritarian dictators during periods when Western governments were actively reassessing their strategic stances. Photographs capturing him in deep, familiar conversation with individuals tied to oppressive autocratic systems fueled intense accusations that he completely blurred the lines between state diplomacy and private networking. Even when these problematic meetings occurred within the technical scope of his official trade mandate, the public perception was that he possessed a fatal attraction to immense wealth. He appeared to crave the company of billionaires and autocrats regardless of the immense reputational risks it posed to the British constitutional monarchy he represented. Leaked diplomatic cables later sent shockwaves through Whitehall, revealing that career foreign officials characterized his diplomatic style as remarkably blunt, arrogant, and inappropriate. In several reported diplomatic exchanges, he allegedly launched into fierce criticisms of British anti-corruption investigations occurring abroad, delivering these rants in a manner that deeply embarrassed career diplomats. Whether those confidential descriptions were slightly exaggerated by frustrated civil servants or completely accurate, they reinforced the devastating public perception that he lacked diplomatic discipline. Within the corridors of power in London, the bureaucratic murmurs regarding his erratic behavior grew increasingly loud and urgent as the years progressed. Civil servants tasked with safeguarding the nation's geopolitical image openly worried that his private associations and reckless comments were actively undermining delicate international negotiations. True trade diplomacy requires an extraordinary level of discretion, intellectual balance, and a deep understanding of nuance, qualities his critics argued he completely lacked. Instead of operating as a strategic asset for British industry, critics argued he functioned more like a high-maintenance celebrity guest exploiting the role for luxury. Meanwhile, his personal lifestyle continued to attract fierce media scrutiny for its sheer extravagance and detachment from ordinary economic realities. Unwarranted helicopter flights to attend prestigious golf tournaments, ultra-luxury penthouse accommodations during official overseas visits, and deep associations with billionaire financiers fed the toxic narrative of indulgence. During fiscal years when public spending was under intense parliamentary scrutiny and working-class families faced severe austerity, these images of royal extravagance struck a raw nerve. The deeper structural frustration within the British public was not solely focused on travel expenses, aviation fuel, or questionable social connections. It was about systemic immunity. He appeared entirely insulated from the real-world consequences that govern ordinary citizens, shielded effectively by intense palace loyalty and his status as the Queen's son. This profound institutional protection fostered a deep, simmering societal resentment that gradually eroded the foundational respect required to sustain a modern hereditary monarchy. By the conclusion of his tenure, he was no longer viewed by Whitehall or the public as a national asset capable of elevating British commerce. He had successfully transformed into a glaring symbol of the blurred lines between public influence, private enrichment, and unchecked personal indulgence. He had become a prince whose proximity to absolute power seemed to benefit his private lifestyle far more than the democratic country he was officially commissioned to represent. The catastrophic turning point arrived through his long-standing personal association with convicted American financier Jeffrey Epstein, a relationship that would dismantle his remaining credibility. Epstein had already been formally convicted of serious sexual offenses involving minors when the Duke of York was photographed walking companionably with him in Central Park. The global media optics of that stroll were utterly devastating, signaling to the world that royal privilege operated completely outside standard moral boundaries. When later pressed by investigative journalists to explain why he chose to maintain close personal contact with a convicted sex offender, his explanation shocked the public. He casually described his continued residence at Epstein's New York mansion as a matter of personal convenience, a statement that sounded chillingly indifferent. The most legally damaging and morally reprehensible allegation came from Virginia Giuffre, who came forward with detailed accounts of systemic exploitation. She explicitly claimed she had been trafficked by Epstein's network and forced into non-consensual sexual encounters with the British prince when she was a vulnerable teenager. The royal completely and aggressively denied ever meeting her, maintaining a stance of total innocence despite the existence of a widely circulated, highly damaging photograph. The photograph clearly depicted his arm around her waist inside a London townhouse, with Epstein's associate Ghislaine Maxwell smiling directly in the immediate background. Rather than addressing the image directly, he suggested to the public that the photograph might have been technologically manipulated or altered by malicious actors. He further insisted that he possessed absolutely no memory of ever meeting the woman, a defense strategy that did nothing to calm the torrent of global outrage. In a high-stakes, desperate attempt to clear his name and salvage his collapsing reputation, he agreed to an unscripted, televised interview with Newsnight. What was intended by his personal advisors to be a masterclass in strategic damage control rapidly devolved into the worst public relations disaster in modern history. He famously claimed he could not have been present at the London club on the night in question because he was at a pizza restaurant. He offered a highly bizarre medical defense, asserting that a wartime adrenaline rush during the Falklands conflict had rendered him physically incapable of sweating. This bizarre medical claim was explicitly designed to challenge the victim's detailed legal account, which noted he had perspired heavily while dancing with her. These highly specific, convoluted explanations were met with immediate, universal disbelief, intense media ridicule, and profound public disgust across the globe. The televised interview failed entirely to project even a microscopic shred of human remorse, genuine empathy, or moral awareness for the victims of trafficking. Instead, international media critics and legal experts concluded that the broadcast conveyed an astronomical level of aristocratic detachment and psychological arrogance. Within 48 hours of the broadcast, a massive institutional exodus occurred as major charities, educational foundations, and corporate sponsors cut ties. The royal family was forced into emergency crisis management, announcing that the Duke would permanently step back from all public duties for the foreseeable future. Eventually, facing the imminent threat of a highly damaging deposition in an American civil court, he reached a multi-million-dollar financial settlement with Giuffre. He reportedly paid an estimated sum of several million pounds to her charitable foundation without formally admitting legal liability or personal guilt. For the vast majority of international observers, this massive financial payout looked less like legal vindication and far more like an expensive avoidance strategy. By that point, His historic titles and military honors had transformed from protective shields into radioactive institutional burdens that threatened the monarchy. He was systematically stripped of his cherished honorary military colonelcies, royal patronages, and officially barred from utilizing the prestigious style of His Royal Highness. The once favored son of the sovereign had officially devolved into the institution's most uncomfortable, toxic, and utterly unmanageable liability. The public anger directed toward him was no longer merely rooted in his historical arrogance or his legendary domestic entitlement within palace walls. It was fueled by a profound, systemic perception that an immensely powerful man had successfully used royal wealth to evade true judicial accountability. The subsequent era of his life became defined by a bitter, humiliating internal exile and the dramatic shrinking of his worldly status. After stepping back from public duties, he retreated into the secure, guarded confines of Royal Lodge within the expansive grounds of Windsor. Yet, this geographical retreat did absolutely nothing to erase the intense media scrutiny or public fascination with his downfall and lifestyle. Internal palace reports suggested that despite his total lack of public duties, he continued to expect full, uncompromised royal treatment from remaining staff. He allegedly demanded elaborate breakfast setups and maintained an expectation of luxury deliveries, proving to critics that his personal sense of entitlement was intact. When Queen Elizabeth II passed away, the powerful protective barrier that had shielded him from the full consequences of his actions vanished instantly. King Charles III ascended the throne facing immediate, mounting institutional pressure to aggressively distance the monarchy from his brother's toxic legacy. Although the formal removal of a peerage dukedom would require complex parliamentary legislation, the new monarch effectively forbade his younger brother from public title usage. The visual symbolism of this internal family sanction was unmistakable to the public and signaled an era of zero tolerance for scandal. He remained a prince by the pure biological accident of birth, but he was entirely stripped of any meaningful constitutional or ceremonial status. He reportedly lobbied the palace hierarchy behind closed doors to regain his ceremonial roles, begging to wear his military uniform at state events. Those desperate efforts were blocked by the king and Prince William, who recognized the severe threat he posed to the institution's survival. Part 2. The internal dynamics of the House of Windsor underwent a profound structural realignment following the loss of its long-reigning matriarch, leaving the disgraced duke completely exposed to the modern realities of public accountability and familial isolation. Without the maternal shield that had so frequently softened his falls, he found himself navigating a radically altered landscape where his historical assumptions of immunity were no longer valid. The new reign prioritized institutional survival above familial sentimentality, a strategic necessity that directly collided with his deeply ingrained expectations of royal prerogative. As the machinery of the state and the palace apparatus moved to formalize his exclusion, the psychological impact of his shrunken status became increasingly visible to those within his immediate domestic circle. The grand corridors of Royal Lodge, once bustling with the sycophantic energy of courtiers and international guests, transformed into a quiet, isolating fortress of resentment. He reportedly spent his days obsessing over press coverage, analyzing legal documents, and nursing a profound sense of grievance against the institution he had spent his entire life exploiting. This internal friction was further exacerbated by the harsh financial realities that accompanied his total banishment from the public stage and official royal duties. Having been decoupled from the sovereign grant, his lavish lifestyle became entirely dependent on the private generosity of the king and whatever remained of his personal investment portfolio. This financial vulnerability became a source of intense leverage for the palace, which sought to manage his public footprint by restricting his access to resources and prominent real estate. Rumors began to circulate with increasing frequency that the king was actively pressuring his younger brother to vacate the 30-room Royal Lodge in favor of a far more modest and easily maintainable property on the Windsor estate. His fierce, stubborn resistance to this proposed relocation became a highly publicized battle of wills that played out across the front pages of national newspapers. To the British public, his desperate, unyielding grip on the sprawling mansion became a vivid metaphor for a man completely unable to accept the reality of his fallen status. The public view of his character hardened into complete cynicism, as stories emerged detailing his refusal to compromise on his domestic accommodations, while ordinary citizens faced a severe cost-of-living crisis. Inside the family unit, the generational divide regarding how to handle his ongoing presence became a source of significant strategic tension. Prince William, stepping into his role as the direct heir to the throne, reportedly adopted an uncompromising hardline stance against any public rehabilitation of his uncle. The future monarch recognized with absolute clarity that the long-term survival of the crown required a total, permanent severance from the scandals of the past, regardless of the emotional toll it extracted from his father. This generational shift meant that the disgraced prince was no longer viewed merely as an eccentric or difficult relative, but as a direct existential threat to the credibility of the modern state. His appearance at family gatherings, once a matter of course, became highly contested logistical problems requiring careful choreography to minimize public backlash and media outrage. During the rare moments when he was permitted to appear in public, such as walking to traditional holiday church services with the extended family, the public reaction was markedly hostile. He was no longer greeted by the polite, deferential crowds of his youth. Instead, his presence frequently drew audible jeers, heckling, and expressions of disgust from onlookers. The protective bubble of royal choreography could no longer completely filter out the raw, unscripted anger of a public that felt profoundly insulted by his continued visibility. These public confrontations served as a stark, recurring reminder that the historical deference once granted to his rank had been permanently revoked by the court of public opinion. He was forced to witness his own historical erasure in real time, watching from the sidelines as the military regiments he once commanded celebrated anniversaries and performed state pageantry without any mention of his name. This systematic dismantling of his public identity was a slow, agonizing process that stripped away the armor he had worn since adolescence, leaving him exposed to the harsh wind of global condemnation. Yet just as the public began to view him as a static, spent force safely confined to the margins of royal history, the narrative took a sudden, unprecedented legal turn that shocked constitutional experts. On a chilly morning coinciding with his 66th birthday, police vehicles arrived at the gates of his private residence, initiating an entirely new chapter of public humiliation. He was formally placed under arrest on suspicion of misconduct in public office, a serious criminal charge originating from a comprehensive review of his controversial tenure as the nation's international trade envoy. The investigation focused heavily on the complex intersection of his official diplomatic duties, his private real estate transactions, and his relationships with foreign oligarchs. For several hours, the son of a British monarch sat inside a standard police interrogation room, subjected to formal questioning under caution by career criminal investigators. Although he was eventually released under investigation without immediate formal charges being filed, the symbolic damage to his name was absolute and completely irreversible. The image of a royal prince being processed through the standard criminal justice system sent shockwaves through the global media, shattering the illusion that the palace could always protect its own. He vigorously denied any criminal wrongdoing, issuing statements through his legal team that characterized the investigation as a baseless, politically motivated overreach designed to exploit his vulnerability. However, these legal denials did nothing to stop the immediate explosion of viral content across international social media platforms, where his downfall was celebrated with dark, unyielding humor. A particularly striking manifestation of this modern, decentralized public anger occurred just days later within the hallowed halls of the Louvre Museum in Paris. A group of highly organized anti-monarchy activists managed to bypass security and briefly hang a large, framed photograph inside one of the main exhibition galleries. The photograph was a raw, unfiltered paparazzi shot capturing the prince slumped in the back seat of a vehicle immediately after his release from the police station. The image captured a broken, exhausted man, his face etched with the profound shock of a reality he had spent a lifetime successfully avoiding. Museum security personnel moved quickly to remove the unauthorized installation within minutes, but the political and cultural point had already been brilliantly made. Video footage of the artistic stunt was captured on mobile phones and spread across global digital networks with terrifying speed, accumulating tens of millions of views within a matter of hours. The viral phenomenon demonstrated that in the digital age, the palace press office had completely lost the ability to manage, suppress, or shape the historical narrative surrounding its members. The image of the slumped prince inside the Louvre became an instant cultural meme, a modern piece of political satire that symbolized the definitive end of royal untouchability. This was no longer a controversy that could be managed with a carefully worded statement or a tactical period of public withdrawal. It was a global cultural moment. The activism highlighted a terrifying new reality for the House of Windsor. Their reputations were now entirely at the mercy of a decentralized, interconnected global public that possessed the tools to amplify humiliation. He had transcended the status of a mere controversial public figure to become a living, breathing symbol of institutional decay, systemic corruption, and unchecked aristocratic entitlement. As police forces continued their meticulous review of financial documents, travel logs, and electronic communications connected to his time as trade envoy, the shadow of potential prosecution loomed large. The absolute certainty that had defined his early life, the unshakable belief that his bloodline exempted him from the rules of ordinary mortals, had been completely obliterated. The public anger that continued to swirl around him was no longer just about the specific legal allegations or the disastrous television appearance. It had transformed into a broader critique of systemic inequality. For the British public, he embodied the deep, terrifying fear that powerful institutions will always prioritize self-preservation and protect their own members until public pressure reaches a violent, unmanageable tipping point. His life story evolved into a definitive historical illustration of how quickly inherited power can curdle into toxic disgrace when it is entirely detached from moral responsibility and human empathy. The title of Duke of York, which he had once brandished in social settings with immense, arrogant pride, had become a permanent mark of dishonor. It stood as a stark, universal warning to the rest of the royal family that in the modern era, titles possess zero inherent value if they are not backed by personal integrity. The illusion of royal mystique, which had survived centuries of political upheaval and social change, had been severely damaged by his actions. As the legal investigations dragged on into the summer months, his isolation within the royal estate became almost total, with family members actively avoiding any association that could taint their own public standing. He had become a ghost within the machine of the state, a prince without a country, a commander without an army, and a man without a shred of public respect. The tragic trajectory of his life served as a reminder that the higher the pedestal of unearned privilege, the more catastrophic and destructive the eventual impact when reality brings it crashing down. The public watched the ongoing unraveling of his life not with a sense of tragedy, but with a profound, justified feeling of cosmic justice long delayed. The era of deference was dead, and he had unwittingly served as its chief executioner, proving to the world that beneath the royal robes there was nothing but an ordinary, deeply flawed man desperately clinging to the wreckage of his own making. The systemic fallout from his downfall forced the monarchy to undergo a rapid, painful modernization process, stripping away the archaic protections that had allowed his behavior to go unchecked for decades. The institution realized that to survive in an increasingly cynical and egalitarian world, it had to demonstrate a willingness to cut away its most rotten branches, regardless of how close they were to the trunk of the family tree. This internal purging, while necessary for the survival of the crown, left the disgraced prince as a lonely, isolated figure navigating the ruins of his own reputation. He remained confined to his shrinking domestic empire, a man out of time and out of touch, watching a world that had moved decisively past him. The ultimate lesson of his spectacular collapse was that no amount of historical prestige, maternal protection, or institutional wealth can forever insulate a person from the moral consequences of their choices. The modern world had looked behind the curtain of his royal title and found an empty vessel, a personality constructed entirely on the fragile foundations of inherited class superiority. When those foundations were subjected to the harsh, unyielding light of legal scrutiny and public anger, the entire structure collapsed with a deafening roar that echoed across the globe. He would live out his remaining years not as a celebrated prince of the realm, but as a historic cautionary tale, a symbol of the profound dangers of unchecked privilege. The narrative of his life had been written not by the palace hagiographers, but by his own profound lack of judgment, his arrogance, and his ultimate refusal to see himself as equal to the people he was born to serve. As the sun set over the manicured lawns of Windsor, the quietness surrounding his residence was a testament to the absolute completeness of his exile from the hearts and minds of the nation. The public had closed the chapter on him long before the police arrived, having already rendered their verdict in the quiet, unyielding court of collective conscience. There would be no redemption arc, no triumphant return to public life, and no historical revisionism capable of cleansing the stains that he had personally inflicted upon his own name. He stood alone in the ruins of his absolute power, a stark reminder that the ultimate measure of a life is found not in the titles we inherit, but in the integrity with which we walk among our fellow human beings. Part 3. The profound cultural impact of this royal collapse extended far beyond the immediate political borders of the United Kingdom, reverberating through the interconnected networks of international society and global media. In the financial districts of London, New York, and Geneva, where the prince had once operated with seamless elite fluidity, his name rapidly transformed into a toxic liability that required immediate institutional containment. Compliance departments within major global banks and private wealth management firms quietly initiated comprehensive audits of any accounts or investment funds remotely connected to his private circle. The elite international network that had once eagerly facilitated his luxury travel and lifestyle dissolved almost overnight, proving that high society loyalty is entirely dependent on the maintenance of public prestige. Those who had once proudly displayed framed photographs of themselves standing alongside the Duke of York at exclusive charity galas and private shooting parties moved quickly to remove the evidence from their office walls and digital profiles. The sudden, brutal chilling effect within his elite social network illustrated the absolute finality of his social excommunication, leaving him intellectually stranded within his own country. This global reputational collapse was further accelerated by the relentless, unyielding focus of international documentary filmmakers and investigative journalists who recognized that his story was a perfect narrative template for the broader global debate regarding wealth and accountability. Television networks across Europe and North America produced primetime investigative specials that meticulously deconstructed his financial dealings, his military record, and his personal psychology with a clinical, unforgiving precision. These broadcasts utilized advanced digital graphics and expert legal analysis to map out the intricate web of his foreign connections, presenting the global audience with a devastatingly clear picture of systemic entitlement. The prince found himself completely powerless to halt the production or broadcast of these highly damaging global profiles, as his traditional legal threats of royal censorship carried zero weight within international jurisdictions. The complete loss of narrative control was a profoundly disorienting experience for a man who had grown up believing that the British monarchy possessed an unassailable authority to shape public reality. He was forced to witness his entire life story being systematically rewritten by international media outlets, transformed from a narrative of noble state service into a dark, cautionary chronicle of aristocratic decay. Within the domestic political landscape of the United Kingdom, his ongoing legal troubles and public disgrace became a permanent weapon utilized by anti-monarchy organizations and radical political factions to attack the structural legitimacy of the crown. Parliamentary debates regarding the annual allocation of public funds to the royal family were routinely disrupted by aggressive questions from Republican lawmakers who pointed directly to his past behavior as proof of a profound systemic lack of oversight. The government of the day found itself repeatedly forced to defend the institutional architecture of the state against accusations that it had actively colluded with the palace to shield a royal prince from criminal investigation for decades. This political pressure created a highly tense, adversarial relationship between the prime minister's office and the palace hierarchy, as elected politicians sought to protect their own democratic standing by demanding total transparency regarding his ongoing security costs and financial arrangements. The public treasury was subjected to intense journalistic FOI requests, demanding the exact disclosure of the public funds utilized to maintain the specialized police security detail that continued to guard his private residence. The revelation that millions of pounds of taxpayer money were still being expended annually to protect a disgraced, non-working royal inside a luxury mansion triggered a fresh wave of public anger during a period of national economic stagnation. Editorials in major national newspapers across the political spectrum began to openly question why a democracy should continue to subsidize the physical safety and domestic comfort of a citizen who had brought nothing but international shame to the nation. The public anger was no longer confined to the radical fringes of internet forums or political protest groups. It had successfully penetrated the mainstream middle-class consciousness of the country, eroding the foundational bedrock of traditional royal support. He had become an unsustainable constitutional luxury, a walking political target whose continued presence within the royal estate actively drained the reservoir of public goodwill that his brother required to stabilize the new reign. As the legal investigation into his conduct as trade envoy entered its second year, the psychological toll of this relentless, multi-front pressure began to manifest clearly in his domestic behavior and interactions with the few remaining loyalists inside his household. Visitors to Royal Lodge described a man who had completely retreated into an alternate, hyper-defensive reality, surrounded by stacks of legal briefs, outdated royal directories, and historical memorabilia from his naval career. He reportedly engaged in lengthy circular rants against the modern media, the political establishment, and members of his own family, convinced that he was the victim of a coordinated historical conspiracy rather than his own profound lack of judgment. He remained utterly incapable of experiencing or expressing authentic human remorse for the reputational damage he had inflicted upon the monarchy or the profound moral hurt experienced by the victims of his associates. His psychological defense mechanism relied entirely on a rigid, unyielding maintenance of his historical entitlement, reacting with explosive anger whenever any staff member or legal advisor attempted to introduce a realistic assessment of his situation. This complete lack of self-awareness and refusal to accept personal responsibility alienated even the most dedicated institutional pragmatists within the palace who had previously sought to engineer a quiet, dignified path toward historical obscurity. The strategy of quiet containment had failed completely, blown apart by the modern realities of decentralized digital activism and independent criminal investigations that operated entirely outside the traditional spheres of royal influence. The viral imagery of his downfall continued to mutate and proliferate across global digital networks, entering the permanent lexicon of modern internet culture as a universal symbol of elite hubris and subsequent ruin. High school history teachers and university professors began utilizing his televised interview and subsequent legal settlement as a definitive case study in institutional crisis management and the psychological effects of absolute privilege. He had achieved a form of dark immortality, his historical legacy permanently decoupled from the noble achievements of his ancestors, and forever tied to the sordid realities of global exploitation and legal evasion. The profound tragedy of his existence lay not in the loss of his material wealth or his physical comfort, which remained substantial compared to the ordinary human condition, but in the total evaporation of his human dignity. He had become a highly visible prisoner of his own inherited status, trapped inside a luxury estate that he could not leave without facing public hostility, and surrounded by a family that viewed him as a dangerous institutional disease. The historical institution that had created him, nurtured his arrogance, and protected his worst impulses for decades had ultimately been forced to cast him out into the cold wilderness of public contempt to ensure its own survival. The evolutionary logic of the British monarchy had asserted itself with a brutal Darwinian clarity, demonstrating that when the preservation of the crown collides with the survival of an individual prince, the prince will always be sacrificed without hesitation. As the long winter months descended upon the great park at Windsor, the isolated lights of Royal Lodge served as a melancholy beacon of a ruined life, a stark physical monument to the absolute limits of dynastic power in the modern democratic age. The public had completely moved on from the active phase of anger and resentment, settling into a permanent icy state of historical dismissal that was far more damaging to his psyche than active protest. He was no longer a figure of immediate political danger. He had been successfully reduced to a historical footnote, a bizarre anomaly in the long lineage of the House of Windsor, a prince who mistook the temporary deference of a class system for permanent personal worth. The ultimate resolution of his narrative proved that while wealth can buy legal settlements and palace walls can provide physical security, they are entirely powerless to purchase the authentic respect of a free society. The final verdict on his life had been written by the collective conscience of a global public that refused to look away from the truth, establishing a historical precedent that would forever alter the relationship between privilege and accountability. He would spend his remaining years navigating the quiet, empty rooms of his fatting empire, a man entirely consumed by the heavy, suffocating silence of a world that had forgotten how to respect him, and a nation that had learned to survive quite well without his presence. His story ended not with a dramatic courtroom verdict or a sudden, tragic exit, but with the slow, agonizing fade of a man who had traded his humanity for a title, and lost both in the process. The lesson of his downfall remained hanging in the global cultural ether, a vivid warning to all future generations of the ruling class that privilege without responsibility is nothing more than a golden path toward permanent historical disgrace.